and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern, and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for listening. Also, check out my latest interview with Jim Miller, Chief of Navigation for the Near spacecraft mission to an asteroid. You can find that at technologyandspace.com. And my interview with Jane Gilmartin, who just published a science fiction novel about a man watching his clone live his life. You can find that interview at fullcontactnerd.com. Thanks again for listening. I'm speaking with Frank Gus Biggio, author of The Wolves of Helmand, A View from Inside the Den of Modern War, published by Forefront Books, and coming out November 10th, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Chris, thank you so much for that introduction. Before we start our discussion about my book, I want to mention two things.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's a real honor to be here, so thank you for the invitation. I've listened to many of the interviews you've conducted, and it's humbling to join the ranks of such distinguished authors and historians that you've had on the show.
Thank you.
You guests have discussed things from medieval warfare to the Civil War to the World Wars and everything in between, and even the warfare of the future where we're going to fight with cyber tools and techniques. So that range of topics makes it clear that much of the history of humankind has revolved around conflict of some sort or another, and it's probably going to continue that way for the foreseeable future. And by the way, the interview with Frank Sisson, where you discussed his book, I Marched with Patton, and his experiences in World War II was fantastic. It made my day.
Thank you.
He's an incredible man, and we're lucky to have him share his story.
Mm-hmm.
Second, this is the first official interview I've had to promote my book. So it's fair to say that today starts the book tour. And I'm proud to say that we're kicking it off from my hometown of Worcester, Ohio, where I was born and raised. So I'm always happy to spend time here with friends and family, and it's very apt to have our discussion from Ohio, since one of the themes I bring up throughout my book is the topic of coming home and being home after serving in war in a faraway place, which is something every person who's served in the military will eventually deal with. So with that, again, thanks for having me, and I turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. And I'll mention to the listeners, we're not doing a video interview, but when I had a brief look, he had a great-looking American flag flying behind him over his left shoulder, so it's a great image. And again, thank you for all those compliments. I really appreciate it. And I really do love what I'm doing. So, thanks. So first, obviously you wrote this book because you were there, you experienced this, but why did you want to write the book?
There's a couple reasons why. I had a non-traditional period of service in the Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
So when I graduated from college in 1993, I went on active duty, and I was in the infantry. I served for a little less than 5 years. I loved my time in service, served with some people who remain some of my best friends today. We obviously got to go around the world and act on behalf of the United States in several places, particularly in the Middle East. But I never intended to be a career military officer. I got out, returned to Ohio, where I went to law school at Case Western Reserve, and then I worked in jobs in finance, in business, in Washington, D.C., and New York. In the early part of the 2000s, around 2006, I was sitting in my law firm, and things were happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I felt that I was missing something and that I wasn't really contributing to society and my country in a way that I had hoped to. One thing led to another. I met a former, now retired general who suggested that I talk to somebody about the Civil Affairs Group, which is a reserve unit based in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And a long story short, after 10 years of being out of service, I rejoined the Marine Reserves with the Civil Affairs Group with the intention of deploying to Iraq or Afghanistan to support the missions there.
Mm-hmm.
When I was deployed in Afghanistan in 2009, my civil affairs team was attached to the 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, which we call 1-5 in Marine lingo.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to Helmand province in a district called Nawa,
mm-hmm.
which at the time was one of the most violent, lawless places in the country.
Mm-hmm.
It was a chaotic, lawless, violent place when we got there. And we did what Marines do, what Marines are known for foremost of doing. And, we fought steadily for probably about a month, 2 months, the first 2 months we were there.
Mm-hmm.
By the time I left, the place had undergone a massive transformation. We had local Afghan leaders in charge. The district center was safe for people to conduct commerce. Roads were secure. People traveled relatively freely throughout the district. And there was a real presence of Afghan government solving Afghan problems for Afghans. I was really proud of that. Throughout the time that I was on the ground there, because of the nature of my job and just because I wanted to leave some legacy for my kids in 20 or 50 years from now, I kept a very detailed journal. Mm-hmm. And that, combined with the various reports I took and the pictures that I took, really brought some of these events back to life, even looking through that material years later. Mm-hmm. When I returned, I gave a talk to my dad's Rotary Club, and one of the gentlemen who I've known my whole life, he's a World War II veteran, he told me, he said, "These are great stories that you've told, but you need to share them with a wider audience. And if you took notes, if you took a journal, put some of these stories down on paper." Mm-hmm. And I took that to heart, and it was a long process, but I think that I produced something worth looking at. And like I said, I'm so proud of the Marines I served with in Helmand province, and I think that the things that they did and the things they accomplished are worth telling. And I hope that when those Marines I was with read the book, that they will feel that I actually accurately captured what we did.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to give people an idea of sort of the work you did. So as you mentioned, you were with the Civil Affairs Group. And for people who aren't familiar with the military or the Marines, which is probably a lot of people, statistically speaking, when someone hears Civil Affairs Group and the fact that your tasks involved, dispersing money and talking with leaders, someone might think, well, that's not very dangerous. Obviously, they're mistaken if they think that. But talk to me about that. What sounds like more of a diplomat's job, but it was more than that. Tell me about that.
Okay, happy to do that. So first of all, I want to talk about civil affairs in general. And with the Marine Corps, and things have changed over time too, but at the time I joined the Civil Affairs Group, it was largely a group of reservist Marines. And these Marines were spectacular, and the personal, professional experiences that they brought to the unit were really diverse and really tremendous. We had people who were lawyers for the Department of Justice. We had a CIA analyst. We had a NASA scientist. We had police, firefighters, teachers, journalists. These were really incredible Marines and individuals who wanted to serve their country as a Marine. Civil affairs, I think it's fair to say that in the modern military, civil affairs could be classified as part of the special forces. Now, maybe not in the sense of what many people think of special forces of like Navy SEALs and Delta Force, but we have a very unique mission, and our mission is to understand everything that goes on in the minds of the locals who we interact with in these places all around the world. And this is particularly important in modern warfare. So we are not engaged in combat operations where we're doing traditional tank battles and artillery battles where you win by seizing ground and terrain and destroying the enemy's forces and equipment. So more so, this what I wrote about is we were at the crux of the counterinsurgency effort that we started in 2009. And it's a bit of a cliche, but it's largely about winning the hearts and minds of the local population. And really, the population and the support of the population is the center of gravity in a counterinsurgency war. So we served alongside infantry Marines. My team was relatively small. There were 7 of us in my team, which include 1 Navy corpsman. But we marched on the same ground, and we shot at the same enemy when we had to as the infantry Marines. But we also sat down with the locals, listened to their concerns, proposed some solutions for their concerns, collaborated with our Afghan partners, collaborated with our civilian advisor friends from the U.S. Agency for International Development and the NATO civilian forces that were with us, and really learned about the things that were important for the Afghans to live a normal and happy and prosperous life.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Frank Gus Biggio, author of The Wolves of Helmand. You can find more information on the book at wolvesofhelmand.com. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at fullcontactnerd.com and technologyinspace.com. And now back to the podcast. Now, if someone were to ask you, well, why couldn't you just identify the enemy and, root them out and capture them or kill them, and then, that would clear out the area and make it safe? What would you say to that?
Well, in modern day warfare, it's hard to know what the enemy looks like. So when our grandfathers and great-grandfathers fought in the world wars, they fought identifiable enemy who could be easily picked out because of the uniforms they wear, the vehicles they drove, and things like that. In Afghanistan and in a counterinsurgency fight, the enemy looks like the local population. So you can't just go out and assume that everybody who doesn't look like a U.S. Marine is one of your enemies. Now, one of the challenges is that oftentimes the people that you might be drinking tea with and chewing on some goat and cooked rice with in the afternoon might be the same person who in the middle of the night is going out and doing some of the insurgent activities, like putting night letters in next to the homes of people who've cooperated with the Marines, or planting IEDs, or even shooting at us and engaging in firefights with us. So it's a challenge. But going out and just trying to do a war of attrition on anybody who doesn't look like a U.S. Marine is not the way to win a modern war, and it's not the way to fight and win a counterinsurgency war.
So tell me, so it seems like it's sort of a balancing act, because the people in the village should be aware of who it is that's doing, this nighttime activity or ambushes or what have you, planting IEDs, but they're not providing that information. How do you, because maybe, for whatever reason they're scared, or maybe they believe in what they're doing. How do you balance that? When you meet with locals, how do you get a sense of what kind of attitude you're dealing with?
Part of the way to answer that question is to recognize the fact that we had plenty of challenges going on in Afghanistan. Primarily was the fact that we don't speak the same language. It's very difficult to find a battalion or even a platoon worth of Marines who can fluently engage with the locals in Pashto, which is the language where we were operating. So there was a lot of skepticism and mistrust when Marines got there in June and July of 2009. Many people thought that we were just going to come there to be a quasi-security force for the election that was going to take place in August and then leave. We proved that that was not, in fact, the case. And the fact that we were still there after the election started to build that trust amongst the locals. We also showed the locals that we were not there to occupy their lands and occupy their houses. We set up our forward operating bases on the outskirts and only used some of the local facilities and buildings when it was clear that they were abandoned. But the most important thing that we showed them that we could be trusted and that we were there for their efforts was we walked everywhere. You can't conduct a counterinsurgency war from behind the door of an armored Humvee or an MRAP. So every Marine in that battalion certainly wore out the soles on their boots, knew every individual in their assigned AO, knew the patriarch, knew who the kids were, knew which people lived in which compounds, and we walked every day. Eventually, people came to know and trust us, and a lot of that skepticism really went away by the time we were turning over to the next battalion. Now, there were certainly some people who no matter what good things we did for the Afghans, still didn't want us there. But I would think that by the time we left, the Taliban influence in Nawa was not so much coming from the locals who lived there, but it was outside influence, probably some people involved with the Taliban who were able to shelter in Pakistan or some of the places where we didn't yet have Marines. So it might be fair to use the term outside agitators were the ones who were continuing to start problems there. But we had several instances where the locals who knew us and trusted us and respected us and what we were doing confided to us where some of these Taliban operatives were working, some of the paths that they were using to get in and out of Nawa, and we were able to shut them down pretty effectively.
So, considering that so much of the mission involved getting to know people, how does a Marine, your basic Marine who's trained to be an amazing killing machine, essentially, effective, well, maybe I shouldn't say killing machine, effective at their job of eliminating the threat in whatever way. How does a Marine like that effectively do their mission, this kind of mission in Afghanistan, in a place like Nawa?
There's a couple ways to do it. The most important is the intensive pre-deployment training regime that we went through. Every Marine that deploys goes through a months-long workup to make sure that they're ready to deploy. And that includes training evolutions, whether they're at Camp Lejeune or Camp Pendleton, but they will certainly go to 29 Palms in the Mojave Desert in California that has a lot of mock-up sites that resemble Afghan and Iraqi villages. And they have role players that take on the personas of different types of people that we could expect to encounter. It's tough these days because, like I alluded to earlier about going to fight World War I or World War II, you can't always identify the enemy. And sometimes the enemy might be the same person that you were having a nice engagement with earlier in the day. But we never sacrificed the core aspect of being a Marine. And like you mentioned, being a Marine is about being a killing machine on behalf of U.S. foreign policy when we have to do that. But we've essentially added to the repertoire of skills that Marines take with them to modern day battlefields. A close friend of mine who I was with in Afghanistan named Brian Heisman, at the time he was a company commander, and he's now a lieutenant colonel, battalion commander. He summed it up really well when he was having a conversation with a reporter that visited us in 2009, who asked him a question similar to yours. Brian's response was, the Marine Corps goes to fight wars with the intention of winning. And if that winning means that we bring a rifle to the battlefield, we will fight and we will win with a rifle. But if that winning means that we take our helmets off and we sit down and we drink tea, that's how we win. If that means that we carry a bunch of school supplies to the local school and hand it off to the superintendent, that's how we win. If it means that we pick up a paintbrush, that's how we win. And I think that he summed it up really well. And it ties in closely with the words that General Mattis said at the start of the war in Iraq. He said, look, we need to prove to the world that there is no better friend and no worse enemy than a United States Marine. And we won in Nawa on both fronts. We won when it came time to engaging in combat, and we won when it came time to engaging on a much more civilized aspect with the locals that we served with.
So, sort of a question that's brewing in my mind. I don't know if it's a devil's advocate question or maybe a philosophical / political one. But so on one hand, the individuals you worked with and yourself, you're trained to have some level of independent action and initiative, but you're also operating, from the commands of higher ups who maybe aren't familiar enough with, the ground floor, the being at the forefront. How do you balance initiative with what someone might think is the best way to do something versus, commands from higher up that maybe don't quite make sense?
Well, my experience dealing with and operating under the guidance of the higher headquarters, and when I say higher headquarters, going all the way up to General Stanley McChrystal, who at the time was the commander of all the U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I think we got clear guidance on how to engage a counterinsurgency war, mm-hmm. and we were given flexibility when we needed to take kinetic action, that we could do that. Mm-hmm. The crux of your question deals with the concept of understanding maneuver warfare, mm-hmm. and operating with a clear commander's intent. Mm-hmm. And everybody really understood that well. I never felt that there was a conflict between what we were doing and experiencing on the ground and what was expected from us at several levels higher, whether it was all the way up to General McChrystal or Brigadier General Larry Nicholson, who was the commander of Marine Forces in Helmand. Mm-hmm. The other thing, those senior generals really had their thumb on the pulse of what was happening in our district. They did not micromanage, but they paid attention to what we were doing and what we were accomplishing. We had the privilege of hosting them on several occasions when they came to visit and see with their own eyes what was happening. And they trusted us. And the fact that they trusted us is a combination of the great leadership we had from the battalion commander, Bill McCullough, and his sergeant major, Tom Sowers, mm-hmm. all the way down to the squad and fire team leaders. And every Marine knew what was expected of them. They also knew that the stakes were high, and they knew that the reputation of our country and our corps was on their shoulders. And they took that seriously and operated with that goal in mind. Okay.
Now I'll ask about 3 different partner forces that you talk about in the book, but maybe you can add to what you've written. And you can answer in whatever order you'd like. But first, the Afghan interpreters that worked alongside the Marines. 2, your British Army and perhaps other country counterparts. And 3, Afghan police and army forces.
Okay. I'll address each of them in the order that you mentioned.
Okay.
And I'm glad that the first one you mentioned was the interpreters, because if that wasn't the first one you mentioned, I would have bumped them up to the first one I want to talk about.
Okay.
We had incredible interpreters, and we could not have accomplished what we did without them. These were sometimes young men, sometimes older men. They sometimes were very fit, sometimes they weren't so fit, but they enabled us to talk to the locals and get our point across. They marched with us everywhere. There was an interpreter, at least one interpreter, with every patrol that went out, and this battalion was on patrols round the clock. They slept and lived in the same conditions that we did, which were very austere and dirty. And they were as essential to us accomplishing our mission as any radio or rifle that we brought with us. So I have utmost respect for them. And it is hard to constantly live and interact the way the interpreters do. They have to take what one party said, mull it over in their brains, and then give an effective translation to the other party. And oftentimes, as you can imagine, sometimes our conversations became very heated and very emotional. And the interpreters always kept the emotion out of it and just relayed the conversation. There's a couple of them that I still keep in touch with, and I consider them lifelong friends. I consider them essentially brothers, and they were just incredible. So we can't do what we do without them. And in fact, I have a chapter in the book dedicated to the interpreters, and I gave just a little bit of a sketch about 4 of them that I worked closely with. But one thing that I feel remiss on is that I wasn't able to add probably about 20 more little character sketches about each of them. So they were fantastic. Now, the Brits, we worked pretty closely with the Brits for the first 2 months that we were there. And they were an important part of the NATO force that was taking part in combat operations in Helmand. Now, when we arrived in Nawa, the first wave of Marines in the battalion that I served with came to a patrol base called Patrol Base Jaker. Mm-hmm. And there were about 50 British soldiers there and a platoon of Gurkhas, about 25 Gurkhas. So fewer than 100 British soldiers. They were really in a tough situation because of their relatively small numbers. They could not travel very far outside the district center without being engaged by snipers or ambushes, oftentimes dealing with IEDs. So just by the fact that they had so few of them, they weren't able to conduct counterinsurgency the way that a battalion of 1,000 Marines that came in the summer of 2009 did. That being said, even though they weren't able to accomplish some of the things that we did, the fact that they knew the terrain and they knew the ground and they knew some of the key players in the district really helped set us up for success, because we were able to glean some of the core intelligence from them, even with their limited presence there. Mm-hmm. The third group that you mentioned was the Afghan police and Afghan army. Mm-hmm. So collectively, we refer to them as the ANSF, Afghan National Security Forces. Mm-hmm. Their quality varied from place to place. I'm not going to beat around the bush and say that they were fantastic. And in fact, some of the early ones that we dealt with were really problematic, particularly the Afghan police that operated in Nawa. The police chief was a very shady guy. He was one of those people that the very first time I met him, my gut feeling told me that he was someone not to be trusted. And there were several instances where he revealed that he was, in fact, not someone to be trusted. And the Afghan police officers who served under him, they really reflected the mood and the personality of their leader, which was not to be desired. They were, in terms of military presence and bearing, they left a lot to be desired. They frequently smoked marijuana on the job. Any police outpost, you'd see several marijuana plants growing next to it, and if you happen to patrol by there at night, you'd catch that distinct aroma of marijuana. He ended up getting replaced by a guy who was actually born and raised in Nawa and had some proper formal police training, and he was known and respected amongst the citizens of Nawa, and there was a big change in the quality and the respect that the local police force had once that new police chief came along. We also had some Afghan National Army soldiers who were with us at various times in different places, and their quality varied. I would say that there were some challenges because some of the Afghan Army units were not Pashto. They might have been units comprised of some of the Tajiks from the north, so there was automatically a language barrier for them to be effective in the district where we were, where the language was Pashto, and they came only speaking Dari. So there were varying degrees of success there. I would say that by the time we left, the Afghan army soldiers who were working alongside Marines in Nawa were pretty good, but they certainly weren't great, and there was a lot of room for them to develop their skills a lot more. We were fortunate that we never had to deal with any of the what some people call blue on blue or green on blue incidents where embedded Afghan soldiers ended up killing NATO forces, but it was something that was always of concern to us. I think that we were able to build a strong level of trust and cooperation amongst them and instill a sense of what I would call Marineness in some of the soldiers we served with. But the quality and the effectiveness of the Afghan National Security Forces was always something that was a challenge that we had to deal with.
When you were there, was the U.S. or NATO engaged in destroying poppy fields, or at that point was it up to the Afghan government to take care of the drug issues?
So the poppy production Helmand province was the world's largest producer of poppies used to be cultivated for opium.
Mm-hmm.
When we arrived in the summer of 2009, the most recent poppy crop had been harvested. So we did not have to deal with the issue of poppy eradication, but it was something that was going to affect the next battalion. One of the big measures that we helped with and we worked with our civilian advisors to push was replacing poppy growing with wheat seeds, because poppy and wheat have the same growing cycles. By the time we got there, we were encouraging and we were helping support some of the distribution programs to give free wheat seed to farmers in exchange for them agreeing to not grow poppy. And they got some form of a stipend, and I don't know the details on that. That was more of a civilian-run program. They got a stipend to not grow poppy. They were also warned very sternly that poppy cultivation wouldn't be condoned. And one of the things that we spoke about with some of the farmers, and they were candid with us, they said, look, you guys are going to come in here and destroy our poppy, and that's going to be tough for our economic circumstances. And we said, we understand, but let's make it clear. Most of the people that were acting as the middlemen for your poppy sales are dead now because we killed them.
Mm-hmm.
And we will do the same thing if you engage in that activity next time you cultivate the poppy crop. So it's probably pretty smart for you to focus on growing wheat. I think that at least for the next cycle after we left, that people heeded that message. I can't really say what has happened several years from there, but it was something that I think we, to coin a phrase, nipped in the bud, so to speak.
I think I heard a news report that the farmers themselves don't make that much more from poppy sales, that really that the Taliban takes it from them if they grow it, pays them not much more, as I said, and it's the Taliban that makes the big money off of selling the poppy. Is that something sort of your experience with that? Are you able to talk to that point at all?
So I can't speak too much for the micro and macroeconomic aspects of poppy growing,
Mm-hmm.
but I think generally what you've said is in fact correct. And that was part of the talking points that we raised with the farmers when they questioned whether or not they would or should grow poppy on the next growing cycles. We pointed out that the risks and the rewards for them is the guys tilling the land were not worth it. And if they might make a few cents or maybe $1 or $2 more per bushel of poppy, that it just was not economically rational or feasible for them to do that.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Frank Gus Biggio, author of The Wolves of Helmand. You can find more information on the book at wolvesofhelmand.com. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep up with my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at fullcontactnerd.com and technologyinspace.com. Now back to the podcast. One of the most moving chapters, well, there are two very moving chapters in your book, and if I haven't said it already, I'll let listeners know this is a really great read. It's a really smooth and easy read with a lot of information, and definitely worth anyone's time to read. I encourage people to read it, in fact. But one of the two moving chapters, I'll mention the first one, where you talk about women, the state of women, and also children come up a lot in your book. Can you talk a little about the importance for you to talk about both women and children?
Certainly. So the first chapter that you refer to is called The Hidden Half. In that chapter, I describe an incident where I was called to have a discussion with a local Afghan man whose wife had been injured in a motorcycle accident. One of the pools of funds that I had access to in my role as a civil affairs officer was able to be used with a pretty wide range of discretion on any type of humanitarian issue that I felt needed to be addressed. Coming into the tent that we used as a medical facility on our patrol base, it was clear that this woman had been very badly injured. She had a very bad head wound. She had some abrasions and wounds on her arm that looked like she had possibly fractured her arm, breaking her fall from a motorcycle accident. And what was also concerning was that she was visibly pregnant. Now, she was awake and alert and was sitting on an operating table, and actually operating cot is more of an appropriate way to describe it. And the Navy corpsmen were treating her wounds, giving her stitches and splinting her arm. And my job was to convince the husband that he should take her to one of the larger hospitals in Kandahar, which I think maybe was about 100 kilometers away. So he was reluctant to do so, but then when I pointed out that he should take her there because it would be good for the doctors to check on her son, and I gestured towards her obviously pregnant belly. I only inadvertently said son rather than baby, but when I suggested that it was a son, he immediately got the hint and said, okay, yes, I will take her to the hospital to check on my son. So I never expected to have any interactions with an adult Afghan woman. But at that point where I was standing, as the Navy doctors started to put stitches into this big wound in her head, my hand actually kind of bumped hers, and she grabbed it and squeezed it and held it while they were finishing their work. So it was something that was really moving to me to have an interaction with an adult Afghan woman that way. Then we treated her wounds, and she put her burqa on and got on the back of her husband's motorcycle, and they drove off. And I gave him probably about $50 to cover his trip to and stay in Kandahar. So that was something that really moved me on an interaction that I never expected to have. There was also a young man named Ishmael, who was probably about 10 or 11 years old, whose parents were killed when the Brits dropped the bomb on their compound when they were taking fire from it on a patrol. So Ishmael was orphaned along with his younger brother, and his grandmother was the sole surviving adult in their family. They only survived because they were out in one of their fields when this engagement was happening. He was just a really handsome guy with a beautiful smile and just a friendly demeanor, and everyone took a strong liking to him. He would come to our base and get some rudimentary English lessons from us, and would kind of wander along next to or beside us oftentimes when we would go out on patrol. And he ended up sort of being his own patrol leader, in the sense that some of the other kids would hang out with Ishmael and they would follow our patrols along. The fact that kids felt comfortable mingling with us on patrols showed that we were succeeding. And some skeptics might say, well, you always had to be mindful of the kid being conscripted to drop a grenade in the middle of patrol or anything like that. And we never let our guard down. We were always very alert. But the fact that the locals trusted us and walked amongst our patrols was a clear sign that they knew us, they trusted us, they respected what we were doing. And again, getting on that theme of winning, we were in fact winning.
Mm-hmm. Let me turn towards sort of kind of step away from the sort of the human aspect of the book. Not that that's, it's very important, but I'd like to turn to the nuts and bolts of what was going on. And that, can you talk about like going on patrols? What sort of equipment did you guys have? What was the terrain like that you were moving through? What was the enemy using against you?
Okay, so as I mentioned, we largely walked everywhere because you can't conduct and you can't win a counterinsurgency fight from behind the door of an armored vehicle. We took care of ourselves, though, in the sense that we were protecting ourselves from small arms fire and IED explosions and shrapnel like that. So we wore plate carriers that had heavy ceramic plates on the front, back, and sides. We had helmets. Every Marine probably had 6 to 9 magazines for their M4 if they weren't carrying one of the larger machine guns or automatic weapons. Most of them would have had 1 or 2 fragmentation grenades. Several of them would have had some kind of smoke grenade. So the gear we were carrying would probably, for the average Marine, be about 70 pounds. Now, keep in mind that this is Helmand province in the summertime, and the temperatures routinely reached and exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And because we were in close proximity to the Helmand River, it was extremely humid. So it was hard work. Compare that to what the typical insurgents' battle gear would be, which would be their shalwar kameez, the typical outfit that an Afghan man wears, and maybe a bandolier of ammunition and an AK-47. Oftentimes, if they would engage with us with small arms fire, they would abandon those weapons and any combat gear and just walk amongst the locals. So it was tough going. I can tell you that much for sure. The terrain in Helmand is relatively flat. It's not hilly and mountainous like some of the images that you might have seen in Sebastian Junger's book, some of the other areas where Marine Dakota Meyer served a little bit north. So our area was relatively flat and largely desert terrain. However, on the west side of the Helmand River, which runs north-south, is a largely irrigated area, so it's quite lush. And there are channels and canals that, interestingly enough, were constructed by the United States Agency for International Development in the 1950s and 1960s. So that cultivated all the farmland. Oftentimes, as we were hunkering down in one of those smaller canals in a shooting match, I wondered to myself if any of the USAID personnel who constructed those canal systems would have ever anticipated that 50 or 60 years later, Americans would have been using them for cover and concealment in a firefight. And that's what we used them for. So it was relatively flat with a lot of lush greenery and farmland for a pretty good area along the Helmand River.
What sort of, so if you were having issues, what sort of support could you call in? Was there any sort of artillery or air power or anything to help you out?
So we did have a lot of those assets available. The patrols that I ever went on, I don't recall ever calling in any type of artillery. And when I say artillery in this context, I'm thinking of the larger artillery, but even mortars. I do know that several times when we were doing some nighttime operations, we would use mortar support for illumination, but we never used anything for traditional indirect fire with that. We had aviation assets on hand quite a bit. A few times we had fixed wing, and I was early on in my time in NAWA, I was with some Brits, and we were in a situation where we called in fixed wing assets. But for the most part on patrols, we had rotary wing helicopter fire support. And we used that occasionally and quite effective. And the nice thing is the concept of the Marine Air Ground Task Force, where Marines on the ground work closely and intimately with their aviation counterparts. The fire support and the familiarity you get with working with a Marine pilot makes for a really seamless combat transaction if you ever have to engage in one.
Mm-hmm. Now, the next question I want to ask about IEDs, and I hate asking sort of a cold, sterile question because I always have to acknowledge that IEDs, took a lot of people sacrificed their lives and limbs, for the country having to deal with IEDs, but I'll just ask, sort of the technical questions. Do you recall, so that sort of IEDs the enemy was using, since it was a lot of foot patrols, were they small IEDs? Can you describe them at all, that whole threat?
Yes, so we encountered all sorts of IEDs. Some of them were smaller ones that a vehicle could have gone over with very little damage, but certainly would have wreaked havoc on a person on a foot patrol. Some of them were extremely powerful and caused extensive damage to those very heavy, very armored, very expensive Humvees and MRAPs. So we came across all kinds with varying levels of sophistication. Some of them were pressure plate IEDs that would have activated as soon as a person or a vehicle stepped over them or drove over them and caused the connections to activate. Some of them were remote detonation devices, and others were activated with things like a pull string or a drawstring, so somewhat remote, but the operator has to be in proximity to the device. But IEDs, they certainly have a tremendous physical effect, and 3 of the 4 Marines who were killed on our deployment were killed as a result of IEDs of one sort or another. They also have a tremendous psychological effect. We were very good about looking for and identifying them. We had a combination of metal detectors, we had bomb-sniffing dogs, but we also had very well-trained, keen-eyed Marines who could look for circumstances in the dirt and against the walls and in the bushes that indicated that something wasn't right. And that's how we found a lot of IEDs. Going back to one of the topics that we discussed early on about the trust and support of the local population that we served, we had quite a few instances where locals told us about the location of IEDs that they saw someone emplacing earlier in the day. So the fact that locals came and told us that information is a clear indication that we had their trust and confidence, because IEDs are largely indiscriminate on who the victim is. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if someone can watch an IED and remotely detonate it only when a Marine is going by, then that's one thing. But many of these were pressure plate IEDs where they put them in place and they don't care who it affects. And unfortunately, we had quite a few locals who were injured and killed by IED explosions that probably would have been intended for Marines, but the insurgents just didn't care because their intent was to wreak havoc and confusion and intimidation.
Considering you walked everywhere, did you move very slowly and carefully everywhere you went with this threat in mind, or was it more, were your patrols more relaxed in a sense, only getting tense where you expected to find a problem or face a threat?
I would say that to use the term that we were relaxed on patrol is definitely not accurate. We didn't necessarily move slowly, but I would say that we always moved deliberately mm-hmm. and cautiously and alertly. So at the same time, we never sprinted on patrol, but we got where we needed to go and we did what we needed to do with clarity and purpose every time we were on a foot patrol.
Mm-hmm. So some of what you said alludes to what I consider I shouldn't say what I consider, which is a very powerful chapter in the book, which is the one on the Marines who sacrificed their lives for this mission. I'll just note that chapter. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I'll just tell listeners that was a powerful chapter. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Okay, I will. So we lost 4 Marines in the battalion on this deployment. And it was tough on everybody who knew them and were affected by their loss. The chapter I wrote about, I wanted to drive home to people who maybe have served and lived through this type of experience, but also for people who might just be curious about what it's like in the military. I wanted to give people a sense of what it's like for someone at home when they get the worst news imaginable. Mm. But then I also wanted to write a short tribute to each of the Marines who were lost, and I wrote it in chronological order to their deaths. So Bill Kerr, who was in my team. He was a civil affairs Marine. Donald Hogan, who ended up being awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for his actions before his death. Chris Baker, who is from Ohio and died in an IED explosion. And Justin Swanson, who was killed, unfortunately, on the Marine Corps birthday. So that was a day that the Marines in the battalion were looking forward to celebrating our birthday, but we tempered that celebration with the fact that one of ours was killed while we were there.
Mm-hmm. So just for this, I could ask a lot more questions, and there are definitely a lot more stories that we haven't even touched on in this interview that are found in the book. There are a lot of personal stories. You discuss your own personal circumstances as far as deployment and sort of the obstacles and things you dealt with your own personal deployment. But what do you think about the mission itself? Do you think were the Afghan people able to learn to take care of themselves from what you did, or once the Marines or NATO forces are gone, does the Taliban just move back in and take over?
Well, unfortunately, if you follow the news, it seems to be what you described, the latter situation seems to be what's happening in a lot of places in Afghanistan, including where I served in Helmand province. We saw some tremendous successes. The NATO forces steadily drew down and turned things over to the Afghan National Security Forces, and the Afghan government was working there. But the Taliban really took advantage of some of the leadership and security vacuums that were created by that, and they've moved on. As you know, we're in a period of negotiations with the Taliban and the Afghan government to pull out entirely of Afghanistan. I have mixed emotions on that. On one hand, as a former military guy and as a taxpayer, I understand the fact that we can't be involved in endless engagements. At the same time, I think of the Afghans I served with and the Afghans I met and the friendships and trust that we developed. And I feel guilty that we're leaving them to the hands of the Taliban, and that there'll be a reversion to the situation that they had pre 9/11, where the Taliban imposed a really strict sense of piety amongst the population, and Afghanistan was essentially relegated to being several centuries behind the rest of the world. So I'm conflicted on what our strategic approach should be. That being said, for the time that I was there and the Marines I served with, we did tremendous work, and we should all be proud of that. And I think that anybody else who served in the country and other parts of the country and saw some of the gains similar to what we did, they should be proud of that too. So there's no policy decision or no high-level action that can take that honor and service away from what we accomplished when it was our turn to fight the war.
Well, consider in the book you wrote, you described how when the Marines were present, when they were able to establish security, how lively and vibrant the district was. People engaged in commerce and social activities and that sort of thing. And it seems that, even if, these people only had 6 months of freedom and improved lives, that plants a seed, maybe for the children or others, that there is something better to aspire to. So I don't know if maybe you can address that. That's just something that I've thought about in the past.
Well, I definitely hope that some of the youngsters that we met when we were there, by this time, 11 years later, they are all young adults. And I hope that they do think back to the time when the Marines were there and how things were and what we helped them accomplish and the leadership example that we set. And I hope that they can take charge of the country and make things like they were when we left Nawa. We get different reports, good and bad, from Afghanistan, and it's a place that I would love to go there in 10 or 20 or 30 years from now and walk some of the same ground and see how things have changed, and hopefully they will have changed in such a way that I can actually take a trip like that.
So what would you like this book to do for readers, apart from telling your story and the story of the Afghans you interacted with and the Marines you deployed with and others that you worked with? What would you like the reader to take away from this book?
Well, I'll look at that from three perspectives. So, and from the viewpoint of three potential readers. So first of all, most importantly for the Marines that I was with in 1-5, I hope they can look at this, read this book, and relive some of the things that we did and accomplished, and feel that I captured their successes accurately. And I hope that they look at the book and think about the good and the bad things that I described, and they say, yeah, he nailed it, and this was an important time in my life, and I'm glad to have this memory of what we did. And I hope the same thing for other people who've served in Afghanistan, whether they were with another branch or in a different part of the country. I hope they come across with the same reflection. I also want this book to reach people that might not have a personal connection to the military, either directly or through a family member. And that's why I wrote a couple chapters about coming home and being home. And I talked about what this was like for my wife to be home working with our young son and then one on the way. And I talked about my return from the military, and as a reservist, I went back to my job, but I had a little bit of adjustment to contend with. And I want people to look at that and say, okay, I understand now what people go through a little bit better. The other thing is that I hope this book will serve as a bit of a legacy on something that I did in a relatively small window of time for my own children and the children of the people who I served with. That whether they read it now or whether they read it from a decade from now, that they can look at this and they can say, okay, here's what my dad and here's what my dad's friends accomplished, and it was pretty impressive, even though at times it seemed like the odds were stacked against them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you might write something else in the future, maybe on this or something totally different?
I enjoyed writing this book, and part of the process of writing it was going through my notes and my journal and photo and remembering some of the things that we went through. The writing process was cathartic at times, and I don't expect to change my career title to author, but I do have a couple ideas for some short stories and one nonfiction book, neither of which has to do with the military or war, but are just some observations that I've had and that I think are worth putting down on paper.
So part of the book, you write about sort of the American public's and the government's attitudes towards the Marines and the military. What are your thoughts about the government's handling of the veterans and the soldiers of these wars, and how the public how the public deals with the non-military public deals with the veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Okay, so I'll answer the first part. The first part deals with how the government's treatment of wars and the military. So we can always do better. We collectively as a country ask a lot of our men and women who serve in the military. So what they have to do is they go overseas and they go to strange places in the world, sometimes that they might never have even heard of, for extended periods of time. They leave their families behind. A lot of people like myself and my friends who are in the civil affairs group, we put our professional careers on hold. And we come back oftentimes to a society that might be indifferent to what we've endured and what our families have endured. I think that in the types of wars we're fighting now, more and more people are coming back with psychological injuries as well as physical injuries sustained from gunshots and IEDs. We can always do better to make the treatment that those folks have that they need to get over their issues need. So that would probably go with reforming the way the VA performs its business, getting the word out that veterans are worth hiring in the civilian work sector, that they bring a lot of talent and skills to the job market, and just truly appreciating what they've gone through. Now, it's common for people to meet a veteran and say, thank you for your service. And I have always appreciated that. And whenever I'm told that, my response is to say that it was my pleasure. And I truly believe it. Sometimes, though, I feel that some of the people thanking me for my service almost do so with a sense of confusion or pity about the fact that I served. And oftentimes that question is followed with a, well, why did you do it? And did you have to go? And it's not really seeking an inspirational answer that might be driven by patriotism or sense of adventure or sense of teamwork, but it's more of a, did you get in trouble? Did the judge tell you had to go, or did you have no other option, or were you running away from something? So there seems to be somewhat of a instinctive knee-jerk reaction for people meeting veterans to say thank you for your service, and then not really having to take into consideration what it means to have served. So I think that, again, that gets to one of the points that I hope my book can reach a wider audience, other than just people who have a connection to the military, so that people can get a sense of that. Now, on the subject of service, although I am extremely proud to have worn a uniform on behalf of my country, there are many other ways to serve, and it doesn't require a military uniform. So I would say to the teachers, and particularly in this troubling time that we're going through, the teachers that are figuring out effective and creative ways to continue to educate our kids is one thing. I think that the police and the firefighters who work long hours and are dealing with some unrest and uncertainty and fear amongst the population are serving. There's a sheriff in Michigan named Chris Swanson, who I found to be tremendously inspiring in some of the early days of some of the protests that were going on, who took his helmet and his body armor off, and he walked with some of the people that were protesting against police violence against unarmed civilians. So he's a real inspiration. He's serving. I think, and this is incredibly important right now, I think that any U.S. diplomat that is helping citizens overseas and representing our interests, even in a relatively trying time where it may seem that their boss or their boss's boss or their boss's boss's boss doesn't really care what they're doing on behalf of the United States overseas. And then, really important for our discussion today and in the coming 2 weeks, are the people who are working overtime to make sure that people can vote effectively and safely and confidently and know that their vote's going to be counted. And of course, everybody who is going to vote. So again, as a military veteran, I'm proud and thankful to have served, and I do appreciate it when people say thank you for your service. But to everybody else out there, I would say that there are other ways to serve, and for those who are serving, then thank you for that. And I would be really remiss, and my wife would give me the cold shoulder if I didn't point out all the healthcare workers who are really doing tremendous things to take care of us in the era of a pandemic. My wife is a doctor.
Okay. Do you get to meet a lot of younger people who are curious or interested in joining the Marines, or maybe aren't, and express sort of like reluctance to join because of they don't want to go to a war like this, or they're not sure of the point of some of what's being done? Do you have much in the way of those attitudes? Do you know?
I get chances to talk to younger folks who are interested in serving in the military, and usually when I have a chance to talk to someone like that, they're already inclined towards making a decision to serve in the military. So their decision, they've already sort of taken one step in that direction. And when I have those conversations, I try to keep them steered in that direction. And although I'm obviously biased in favor of the Marine Corps, the other branches have some good things to offer too, that maybe the Marine Corps is not able to give them with some of their objectives on what they want to do professionally or through the Marine Corps. So I haven't had many opportunities to have conversations with folks who aren't interested in the military one way or another, and have to sort of convince them that they should do it. But again, when I talk to some young folks who are contemplating what they want to do with themselves and in their lives, and for maybe just a 4-year period, I always tell them that the Marine Corps is a good option.
So where can people find this book or maybe your other thoughts online? Do you have a website or anything?
I do. I have a website for the book. It's wolvesofhelmand.com, and you can learn a little bit more about the book on that website. I also have a Facebook page for the book that is The Wolves of Helmand, and I post on there a couple times a week with some excerpts from the book and some photos that some of the tremendous combat camera Marines who were with us took. And you can also buy the book. It's available for pre-order now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's being distributed with Simon & Schuster, so it'll also be available in bookstores on and after November 10th.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Well, Chris, this was really enjoyable to chat with you. And like I said, this is the first interview that I've had, so this really is the kickoff of the book tour. And in this era of a pandemic, a book tour takes on a different format. Yeah. So this was a real pleasure. And like I said, you've had some tremendous guests and historians and authors on your show, and it's just really humbling, and it's a big honor for me to join their ranks. So I hope that your listeners have enjoyed this discussion, and I hope that they will be interested in picking up a copy of The Wolves of Helmand, and encouraging their friends to pick up a copy as well.
Yes, I thank you, and thank you very much for speaking with me.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. If you want more military history ranging from the ancient to the modern, please visit WarScholar.org or MilitaryHistoryPodcast.com to sign up for my weekly newsletter and keep track of my latest posts. You can also find written interviews and my social media links there. Thanks for listening.